An emergency crisis debriefing report dated August 2026. Subject, Kendra Vance. Age, 26. Location, Newark, New Jersey. Projected liquidity collapse, 45 days. Net worth, minus $38,000. Current cash reserves, 0. The heavy iron chains clanked against the frozen metal tailgate at precisely 5:45 a.m. A gust of icy Atlantic wind swept across the overgrown backyard of 142 Elm Street, Newark, driving sub-zero sleet straight into Kendra Vance's pale face. Standing in the freezing drizzle, her breath forming frantic white plumes in the twilight, the 26-year-old public high school counselor stared down at the neon-orange hazardous waste notice freshly slapped onto her wooden front door. "We are looking at a catastrophic environmental hazard, Miss Vance," the senior compliance officer from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection declared, his voice cold, clinical, and completely devoid of empathy as he clicked his heavy clipboard. "Our ground-penetrating radar confirms a massive legacy underground storage tank buried beneath your property. It has ruptured. Leaking heating oil has saturated over 40 cubic yards of soil. The contamination plume is moving toward the municipal storm drain." Kendra felt the ground beneath her worn snow boots dissolve into an abyss. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "How much?" she managed to whisper, her fingers trembling inside her damp gloves. The officer did not even look up from his digital tablet. "Mandatory emergency containment, soil excavation, hazardous material disposal, and environmental clearance testing. Base estimate is $25,000. You have a strict deadline of 45 calendar days to complete full remediation and file the final compliance certification. Failure to comply will result in an immediate administrative fine of $500 per day. Furthermore, the state of New Jersey will place an environmental lien directly against your property title. That triggers an automatic default on your primary mortgage, accelerating full loan recall and initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings." $25,000. The number echoed inside her head, turning into a deafening roar. Kendra was not a high-flying Wall Street trader or a real estate mogul. She was a public school counselor making a modest salary, battling to stay afloat in one of the most expensive East Coast corridors in America. She had spent every single penny of her life savings, wiped out her modest savings account, and scraped together every scrap of credit just to secure a small down payment for this modest 1970s suburban house. She thought she was building a future, a safe haven where she could escape the relentless pressure of her $38,000 student loan debt burden. Instead, she had just walked straight into a financial death trap. Her current liquid bank balance stood at exactly $412.18. Her credit card portal, available credit limit $150. She called her primary mortgage lender, begging for a home equity line of credit known as a HELOC, or an emergency loan refinancing option. The loan officer on the other end was icy and brief. "I am sorry, Miss Vance. Because your real estate title is compromised by an active state environmental investigation, the property cannot be used as collateral. Your application for a HELOC is officially denied. Under federal underwriting guidelines, an active environmental lien risk makes your asset unbankable." She hung up, her chest heaving as silent tears carved warm tracks through the road grime on her cheeks. She was trapped. If she defaulted, her credit score would collapse. Her house would be seized under foreclosure. Her professional license as a school counselor could be endangered by a bankruptcy filing, and her financial future would be permanently ruined. She knew she had a secondary skill. At night, after grading papers and managing troubled teenagers at school, Kendra worked as a freelance digital image retoucher. Armed with a high-end graphics tablet and an obsessively meticulous eye for visual detail, she spent hours correcting skin tones, removing background distractions, and restoring wedding photographs for local studios. But she had always treated it as a low-tier side hustle, charging a meager $10 to $15 per image on discount freelancing platforms, earning barely enough to cover her weekly grocery bills. Can a $15 an hour photo editor generate $25,000 of pure liquid cash flow in less than 6 weeks? The math was brutal, cold, and unforgiving. At $15 per photo, she would need to retouch 1,666 high-complexity images in 45 days, an impossible human feat, requiring 40 hours of work every day without sleep. The clock was ticking. Day 1 was already slipping away. By day 5, the stress had metastasized into physical illness. The smell of heating oil was seeping through the floorboards of her basement, filling her home with a nauseating chemical stench. Every knock on the front door felt like a battering ram hitting her soul. Debt collectors for her student loans were calling twice a day, demanding monthly payments she could no longer afford while maintaining her bare-bones budget. Desperate for immediate capital to pay a mandatory $1,500 environmental engineering deposit just to pause the daily $500 state fines, Kendra decided to sell her 10-year-old compact car. She drove the dented sedan to an industrial scrapyard and vehicle auction depot on the grim, salt-encrusted outskirts of Newark. The scrapyard was a labyrinth of rusted steel, crushed engine blocks, and towering mountains of discarded industrial copper. The air smelled of burnt grease and cut metal. Behind a battered iron desk inside a drafty office stood Mr. Buck. He was 60 years old, wearing grease-stained canvas overalls with calloused thick hands and calm gray eyes that seemed to evaluate the structural integrity of everything they touched. Mr. Buck was not just a scrap dealer. He was a silent millionaire, a veteran of industrial asset recovery, who had spent 40 years building a massive net worth out of the waste products that modern society tossed aside. Kendra laid her car ownership title on the greasy desk, along with a binder containing crisp, perfectly lit, ultra-high-resolution photographs of her car's engine, undercarriage, and interior. Mr. Buck picked up the printed photos, turning them over in his heavy hands. He did not look at the car parked outside. He looked at the pictures. Then he looked up at Kendra's red-rimmed, exhausted eyes. "You took these photos yourself?" Mr. Buck asked, his voice low, raspy, and grounded like grinding gears. "Yes," Kendra said, her voice shaking slightly. "I am a freelance digital retoucher. I cleaned up the lighting, color-corrected the rust spots without hiding the actual condition, and framed the mechanical components so an inspector could verify the VIN without crawling under the chassis." Mr. Buck set the photos down slowly. "Most people bring me dirty, blurry phone snaps of a broken vehicle and lie to my face about its value. You brought me an absolute masterclass in visual asset presentation. You possess a rare, hyper-detailed precision, young lady, but you are bleeding inside. Why is a woman with this level of visual intelligence selling her primary transportation on a freezing Tuesday morning?" The dam broke. Standing in that drafty scrap yarn office, surrounded by the deafening sound of hydraulic metal crushers, Kendra poured out her nightmare. She told him about the ruptured underground storage tank, the $25,000 environmental cleanup mandate, the 45-day deadline, the $500 daily fines, her ruined credit score, and the terrifying prospect of imminent foreclosure. Mr. Buck listened without interrupting. He did not offer empty sympathy. He did not tell her everything would be okay. Instead, he pulled out a thick yellow notebook, grabbed a heavy carpenter's pencil, and drew a single vertical line down the middle of the paper. "You are panicking because you are viewing your life through the lens of a wage earner," Mr. Buck said calmly, tapping the lead against the desk. "You think income is tied to hours traded at a public job. You think debt is a death sentence. You are wrong. Debt is simply an unleveraged liability, and your financial crisis is nothing more than a severe cash flow velocity problem." He pointed his pencil at her. "Look at what you just did. You took a $1,000 junk car and presented it in a way that made it look like a $3,000 reliable utility vehicle. You transformed raw data through high-value positioning. Your problem isn't that you lack skills, Miss Vance. Your problem is that you are selling gold at the price of scrap metal." Mr. Buck slid a worn, leather-bound notebook across the desk toward her. The pages were yellowed, filled with hand-drawn charts of industrial real estate, scrap commodity cycles, asset allocation formulas, and risk mitigation strategies. "If you want to survive the next 40 days and build a financial citadel that no state bureaucrat or economic storm can ever destroy, you must execute a strict 3-tier financial architecture," Mr. Buck said, his eyes locking onto hers with absolute intensity. "First, short-term cash flow velocity. You must instantly abandon your $15 freelancing gig. You will repackage your visual precision into an exclusive high-ticket visual asset restoration service, targeting elite probate attorneys, high-end luxury real estate brokerages, and high-end law firms in Manhattan and North Jersey. You will charge $150 to $300 per asset file, generating $600 to $1,000 a day in high-margin active cash flow. Second, financial citadel budgeting and debt avalanche. You will slash your personal overhead to bare-bones survival levels. Every single dollar of excess active cash flow will not go into passive savings accounts earning weak interest. It will be aggressively directed through a debt avalanche protocol, destroying your highest-cost liabilities and immediate legal penalties first to defend your capital preservation baseline. Third, long-term wealth creation. Cash flow solves temporary problems, but assets create permanent power. You will learn how wealth is built in the dark by leasing undervalued, ignored physical assets like distressed industrial staging yards or raw metal scrap claims, and converting active cash into inflation hedges like physical gold bullion and diversified low-cost index funds within tax-advantaged accounts. Kendra stared at the leather-bound notebook, then at the hard-faced old man in front of her. It sounded insane. She was a school counselor, not an industrial investor or a luxury business strategist. "Take the book," Mr. Buck said, pushing her car title back to her, along with a check for $1,500 as a short-term private loan secured against her retouching equipment. "Do not sell your car. You need mobility to survive a storm. Go home, fix your business positioning, and stop acting like a victim." Kendra grabbed the leather notebook, her knuckles white around the cracked binding, and drove back through the freezing Jersey rain. Her mind was a chaotic battleground of fear and adrenaline. The $1,500 loan from Mr. Buck bought her precisely 72 hours before the state compliance officer returned to audit her property's containment progress. That night, shivering in her living room with space heaters blasting on high, Kendra initiated step 1 of the financial citadel protocol: short-term cash flow velocity. She did not touch her old freelance profiles. Following Mr. Buck's instructions, she systematically scrubbed her digital presence. She rebranded her service from cheap photo editing to high-end visual forensic and historical estate restoration. She built a sleek, single-page digital portal targeting elite probate attorneys, high-end antique auction houses, and luxury historical real estate firms in New York City and Greenwich, Connecticut. Clients for whom image quality directly impacted multi-million-dollar property valuations and estate liquidations. She packaged her skill set into high-ticket tiers. $250 per file for historical architectural photo restoration and $500 for comprehensive visual asset documentation packages. Then came the brutal slap of reality. On day 12, driven by sheer desperation and breaking one of Mr. Buck's explicit warnings about reckless marketing spending, Kendra spent her last remaining $800 from her liquid savings on targeted social media ads. She targeted low-tier local real estate agents, hoping for quick volume. The ad campaign was an absolute disaster. The click-through rates were abysmal. The few leads that came in were cheap bargain hunters begging for $2 photo touch-ups. By midnight on day 14, her ad budget was completely wiped out. Her bank account balance hit zero. Sitting behind the wheel of her idling compact car in a deserted, snow-covered parking lot outside a 24-hour diner, the heavy silence of the night crushed her. The engine hummed weakly as sleet pelted the windshield. She slumped over the steering wheel, sobbing uncontrollably. The dark thoughts crept in like poison. She was just a school counselor playing games she didn't understand. She couldn't outrun the legal system. She couldn't outrun a $25,000 debt. Her friends had been right. Bankruptcy was the only logical escape.
Lying on the passenger seat was Mr. Buck's leather notebook, its worn cover dusted with dry salt from her boots. Kendra wiped her eyes, pulled the notebook toward her under the dim amber glow of a street lamp, and opened it to a page marked with thick red grease pencil. Amateurs focus on volume. Masters focus on frictionless leverage. When cash crunch hits, do not beg the market for work. Find the party whose financial loss is greater than your price tag. Kendra stopped breathing. She reread the sentence 3 times. She was looking at the wrong market. She didn't need hundreds of retail clients. She needed corporate entities losing tens of thousands of dollars every day due to poorly documented assets, contested insurance claims, and delayed probate sales. The next morning, on day 15, Kendra pivoted with ruthless precision. She targeted high-volume estate litigation attorneys in Manhattan who were struggling to liquidate high-value historical estate assets tied up in complex family disputes. She pitched them directly via video audits, showing them how her forensic digital restoration of decade-old architectural photos, deeds, and land surveys could prove structural baselines, resolve title disputes faster, and unlock millions in frozen real estate value. The shift was instant and violent. On day 18, a high-net-worth probate firm in Manhattan signed a retainer, 10 historical estate asset files at $300 per file, $3,000 delivered in 48 hours. On day 22, a boutique commercial real estate developer in North Jersey hired her to digitally restore and color-correct an entire archive of damaged 1950s blueprints and property aerials for a zoning board presentation. Invoice total, $4,200. Her active cash flow exploded to $800, then $1,200 a day. Every night, while the rest of Newark slept under the blanket of winter snow, Kendra sat under the harsh white LED glow of her monitors, her tablet pen fly-stitching pixels, aligning historical channels, and perfecting visual metadata. Her fingers were cramped, her eyes burnt with fatigue, but her financial engine was roaring. She implemented Step 2, the financial citadel bare-bones budget. She cut her personal expenses down to the raw bone. No dining out, no subscriptions, no non-essential utility usage. Every single dollar of excess net cash flow was routed directly into a strict debt avalanche protocol. She didn't spread her cash thin. She targeted her highest cost, most dangerous liability: the mandatory state environmental remediation deposit and accrued non-compliance penalty threats, extinguishing high-interest debt and legal exposure with mathematical ruthlessness. By day 29, Kendra had generated $14,000 in pure liquid cash from her high-ticket visual restoration operations. She paid the primary environmental contractor a massive cash installment, holding the daily state fines at bay. She was closing the gap. She was actually going to win. Then, on day 30, the ultimate nightmare struck. At 7 a.m., heavy diesel excavators roared into her small backyard. The earth-moving equipment tore into the frozen ground around the buried oil tank. 2 hours into the excavation, the lead engineer abruptly ordered the machinery to halt. He walked up her back steps, his face grave, holding a clear glass sample jar filled with murky, black-streaked groundwater. "Miss Vance, we have a catastrophic compounding variable," the engineer said, his voice flat. The tank didn't just leak into the topsoil. The bottom seam of the steel vessel completely failed. The oil plume has penetrated 8 feet deeper than the initial ground radar indicated. It has breached the localized shale layer and reached the shallow water table. Kendra felt all the air leave her lungs. "No," she whispered. "No, please." Under New Jersey environmental law, a water table breach triggers mandatory deep well monitoring and high-volume fluid extraction, the engineer continued coldly. Our baseline environmental cleanup scope just expanded by 40%. The updated cost for complete excavation, fluid recovery, and soil stabilization is no longer $25,000. It is now $34,000. And because of the water contamination risk, the state DEP is reducing your remaining compliance window from 15 days to 7. $34,000. 7 days. Before Kendra could even process the crushing blow, her phone buzzed in her hand. It was an urgent email notification from her employer, the public school district. Due to municipal budget deficits and severe state funding cuts, 3 mid-level support positions were being immediately scaled back. Her primary salary was reduced by 50%, effectively destroying her steady base income and destabilizing her credit risk profile for any traditional bank assistance. The world went dark. The sheer mathematical impossibility of the situation descended on her like a crushing slab of concrete. She walked back into her house, locked the door, and sank down on the bare wooden floor of her hallway. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. The fatigue was too deep, the financial pressure too absolute. She lay flat on her back, staring blindly up at the peeling paint on the ceiling, listening to the heavy thud of the excavator idle outside her window, idling away her remaining time, idling away her life.
She had worked 20 hours a day. She had built a high-ticket cash flow engine from scratch. She had followed every financial rule Mr. Buck had laid down. And yet,
The broken, rigged system had simply shifted the goalposts, demanding more capital than a single human being could possibly extract from raw labor in 7 days. She closed her eyes and let the darkness wash over her. She was done fighting. For 3 hours, Kendra lay motionless on the cold floor. The house grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, razor-sharp shadows across the room. At 10 p.m., unable to sleep, her mind operating in a surreal state of hyper-detachment, Kendra sat up. She felt a strange, cold clarity take over. If she was going to be ruined, if her house was going to be seized under an environmental lien, if her net worth was going to be permanently forced into negative territory, she wanted to look at the exact mechanism that had executed her. She walked over to her desk, turned on her computer, and opened the original legal closing documents from when she bought the property 8 months ago. Specifically, she pulled up the digital PDF of the seller's formal property condition disclosure statement and the accompanying home inspection report provided by the seller's agent. She opened the inspection report's primary attachment, a high-resolution photograph of the backyard's south corner taken by the seller's hired inspector, claiming to show a clean, undisturbed lawn with no evidence of underground fuel storage infrastructure. Kendra stared at the image. Her eye, trained through thousands of hours of high-end digital retouching, zooming in to 800% magnification on individual pixel clusters, caught a minute visual anomaly. Along the bottom border of the wooden fence in the background, the shadows were inconsistent. The light source coming from the upper left created soft-edge shadows under the fence pickets everywhere, except in a 4-foot region directly over the buried tank location, where the shadow edges were unnaturally sharp and slightly misaligned by 3 degrees. Kendra's heart skipped a beat. She dragged the digital file into her professional forensic imaging software. She isolated the color channels, applied an error-level analysis filter, and adjusted the luminance frequency curve. The image instantly flashed bright magenta across the localized lawn area. The image had been altered. Someone had taken a photo of a backyard that featured a prominent, visible steel filler cap and air vent pipe for an underground oil tank, and used professional clone stamp and content-aware fill techniques to digitally erase the tank hardware, blending artificial grass pixels over the evidence before submitting the document to the mortgage company and the buyer. Kendra sat frozen in front of her monitor, her eyes reflecting the glowing magenta warning on her screen. This was not a case of an unknown legacy environmental defect hidden underground. This was a deliberate, premeditated criminal act of digital forgery and real estate fraud, fraudulent concealment. She didn't just have an image file. She had the raw digital forensic proof. Kendra spent the next 5 hours isolating the EXIF metadata of the file. She extracted the original camera serial number, the precise software build used to edit the image, and the timestamp showing the photo was modified inside the seller's attorney's office 48 hours before closing. At 8 a.m. on day 32, Kendra walked into the high-rise law office of the seller and his real estate legal team in downtown Newark. The lead defense attorney sat across from her, wearing a tailored 3-piece suit, looking at her with cold, dismissive condescension. "Miss Vance, I suggest you don't waste our time," the attorney said, tapping his gold pen against a leather folder. "You signed an as-is purchase contract. In the state of New Jersey, caveat emptor applies. The buyer assumes all environmental risks post-closing.
If you cannot afford the state remediation mandate, that is an issue between you, your bank, and the Department of Environmental Protection. My client owes you nothing." Kendra didn't say a word. She calmly pulled out her laptop, turned it around, and pressed play on a side-by-side forensic video analysis. On the left screen was the seller's submitted property inspection photo. On the right was the pixel-isolated metadata-decoded forensic layer breakdown, clearly demonstrating that the seller's team had digitally erased the oil tank cap to pass the lender's appraisal checks. This is a complete visual forensic breakdown of the inspection report submitted during escrow, Kendra said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, unshakable register. The metadata proves this image was altered in your client's primary office network on October 14th using an unlicensed copy of image editing software. That constitutes first-degree real estate fraud, bank fraud under federal lending statutes, and willful concealment of a hazardous waste liability. The attorney's gold pen stopped tapping, his face drained of all color. "What do you want?" he whispered. $34,000 in immediate certified wire funds paid directly to the state-approved environmental remediation contractor by 4 p.m. today, plus a full legal release of liability. You have 4 hours.
By 3:30 p.m. on day 32, the legal settlement was signed, sealed, and executed. The seller's bank transferred $20,000 directly into an escrow account dedicated to her property's environmental remediation, while Kendra's booming high-ticket visual restoration business contributed the remaining $14,000 generated from her active income surge. The heavy, hazardous waste equipment rolled back onto her property, but this time, every single dollar was fully funded. The ruptured tank was extracted, 40 tons of contaminated soil were safely removed, the water table was stabilized, and the New Jersey DEP issued a formal Clean No Further Action, or NFA, certification. Her property title was completely cleared. The threat of an environmental lien was dead. Her credit score was saved, rising from the brink of destruction back up to a pristine 752. Kendra stood in her backyard on day 45. The air was crisp and clear. The ground was freshly graded, level and clean. She wasn't celebrating, she was executing Step 3 of the financial citadel system, long-term wealth accumulation. Over the next 12 months, Kendra transformed her entire life by applying the 3-tier financial system Mr. Buck had passed to her. In months 1 through 3, she maintained her high-ticket visual restoration operations, capping her active income at over $14,000 per month. She systematically eliminated every single cent of her remaining student loan debt using the debt avalanche method, bringing her high-interest consumer debt burden to absolute zero. In month 6, Kendra established an emergency liquid reserve of $8,000 parked inside a high-yield savings account yielding maximum compound return to act as a permanent cash buffer against future life shocks. Then she partnered with Mr. Buck to execute an asset recovery strategy. Using her capital, she acquired a long-term lease on an underutilized 3/4-acre industrial lot near the Newark shipping ports, a site previously abandoned due to minor zoning issues. She cleared the site, subdivided it, and leased it as a high-margin metal scrap staging yard for local independent salvage contractors.
By month 12, that single industrial land lease generated a steady $2,200 per month in high-margin passive cash flow. Combined with her scaled visual restoration studio, her total net monthly cash flow hit $4,500. She did not inflate her lifestyle. Following strict asset allocation principles, she channeled 30% of her net monthly cash flow into tax-advantaged accounts, maximizing her Roth IRA through continuous dollar-cost averaging into broad market index funds like low-cost S&P 500 index vehicles, capturing long-term compound growth. To protect her growing wealth against post-pandemic inflation and currency devaluation, she converted a fixed portion of her excess reserves into physical gold bullion, securing physical ounces inside a private depository. Her net worth, which sat at minus $38,000 on that freezing morning 45 days prior, soared to a positive $48,000 by the end of year one and was climbing rapidly on an exponential compounding trajectory. She walked into the school principal's office and handed in her formal resignation, leaving behind the underpaid, high-stress job that had once trapped her. She wasn't fleeing society, she was entering it on her own terms, backed by an unshakable asset base. On a warm afternoon in late August 2026, Kendra drove back to the industrial scrapyard on the outskirts of Newark. Mr. Buck was standing near the main iron gate, watching a crane load shredded copper onto a flatbed truck. He looked up as Kendra walked toward him, wearing a sharp blazer, holding a dark leather briefcase. She opened the briefcase, pulled out Mr. Buck's original leather notebook, and set it down alongside a custom physical 1-ounce 9999 fine gold bullion bar as a token of absolute honor. "The debt is paid," Kendra said, a calm, confident smile breaking across her face. Mr. Buck picked up the gold bar, feeling its heavy density in his palm, then looked at the woman standing before him, no longer an anxious, overwhelmed school counselor drowning in liability, but a cold, calculating, disciplined master of cash flow velocity and asset preservation. He nodded slowly, a rare, proud grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't just survive the storm, Miss Vance," Mr. Buck said softly. "You built the citadel." Kendra looked out over the vast expanse of the industrial yard, the sun reflecting off the mountains of raw steel and copper ready for processing. She knew now what true financial power meant. The greatest asset in human life does not consist of a temporary static number sitting inside a fragile bank account. True wealth is the unshakable capacity to convert raw chaos into relentless cash flow, to master the ruthless mathematics of debt, and to erect an impenetrable financial citadel of real physical assets that no economic storm, no legal system, and no rate of inflation can ever tear down.